Thanks for the one clap, I appreciate that. So the rest of you, you can all leave now, thank you, please. So yes, it's a bloody barley talk and it's bloody Blakely up here, so please deal with the subject that I'm going to talk about. So yeah, I'm here to talk about barley. It's really important. Later on you'll taste some of it and you'll work out why it's so important. Okay, so my key messages are twofold. Firstly, it's about, yes, everyone's talking about high marsh. Yes, high marsh is going to be 40 to 50% of the barley area this year. Could be 60 to 70% next year. It is the benchmark variety that we're going to base all of our decisions on now. So basically, we're working off high marsh as our starting point, not a malt variety as we used to do in the old days. But I'm going to tell you that high marsh is beatable, and there are instances where you're going to have variety options that are going to be better than high marsh. So they're going to be where you've got a potential yield above 3 tonnes per hectare, where you've got subsoil acidity, or where you've got brome grass and barley grass. I'm also going to talk a little bit about grain protein concentration. Again, one of the important quality factors in malt barley. Most of the time, most of the differences we see are just purely due to yield dilution. But there are some differences in varieties that are genetic, and then they need to be considered in your nitrogen management processes that you put in place. What I'm going to cover is malt barley first up and talk about it relative to high marsh. I'm going to talk about litmus, but I'm not going to cover brome grass or barley grass management. And then I'm going to talk about grain protein. Okay, so first up, this is really the crunch point of why you would grow malt versus a food. It's the economics. That's the basis for all of our decisions. This chart just goes through some of that decision making. So what we've got on the top is the realised premium that you get from a malt barley. So it could be, say, between $10 to $30 a tonne. Then I've given you some feed barley options prices of $160 to $280 a tonne. And then I've said, okay, what yield does high marsh need to achieve above a malt barley to return the same profit? So if I said the feed barley price was $250 a tonne, and we had a realised premium of $25 a tonne, then if high marsh yields 10% higher than a malt barley, then you're going to make the same money. Okay, so how do you calculate your realised premium? Well, I've given you a couple of examples, and there's several ways of looking at it. So obviously you have the malt barley premium over feed that you commonly see. So in one example, if I said that the malt barley premium is $40 a tonne, and 50% of my malt actually achieved the malt 1 grade, then my premium's $20. If it's going to cost me, say, another $5 to grow a malt barley because I need to put on more fungicides, or I've got to cart it to a different bin, so it might be another $5 a tonne in extra costs in growing it. Then relative to high marsh, there's about a $2 or $3 extra endpoint royalty that you've got to pay per tonne. Currently, the premium for high marsh is obviously substantially higher than that, but we expect long term that the price of high marsh will be between $5 to $10 above feed. So if the premium was $6 and 50% of your high marsh went beef food 1, then the realised premium in that particular example would be $10. In another example, it might be $20 a tonne. Okay, so if we're going to benchmark ourselves where we're at, so if we said that the feed price was $220 a tonne, if our realised premium is only $10 a tonne, then high marsh only needs to yield 5% more than a malt to make it worth growing high marsh. If our realised premium was $20 a tonne, then high marsh has only got to yield 9% more than a malt barley, again, to make the decision to grow high marsh easy. So effectively, when we're growing a malt, we need to be within 90 to 95% of high marsh to actually start even considering if we're going to grow a malt. Okay, so let's look at what the NVT data says. This is what the NVT data says. This is the 2009 to 2013 meta-analysis over the 6 ag zones. It's all in red and it's all negative. No malt variety out-yields high marsh in a meta-analysis. There's some of them, the ones that are highlighted in the light peach boxes, are within 5% of high marsh, and there are also some that are within 10%. So in terms of chasing that 90 to 95%, there are some situations, but clearly we're not very close overall for most of the malt varieties to Hindmarsh. So are there situations in which a malt barley can out-yield Hindmarsh? Okay, so yes, there is. So this is a combination of the NVT data and the barley agronomy data collected for the period of 2009 to 2013. There's 220 examples in this data set, and all 7 varieties were in all 220 comparisons. So this is a functional linear regression analysis where we've compared one of the malt versus Hindmarsh and then reversed the axis and we fitted the function that you see. And so clearly, you know, once you get above 4 tonnes per hectare, varieties like Granger clearly start to come into their own and clearly show yield potential, and other varieties do at different points. So in my previous economic thing, I showed you that you needed to be within 5 to 10% of Hindmarsh to consider growing a malt. So if you put that line on this particular graph, that's where it would dissect that data set. And that's the critical point at which you say, am I growing that yield with this particular variety? If I am, then I might actually grow it ahead of growing Hindmarsh, or I might as well grow Hindmarsh. Okay, so let's look at those critical points. So this is the yield target that you need to achieve to equal Hindmarsh. So this is not what Hindmarsh needs to equal your malt. This is what you need for your malt barley to equal Hindmarsh to return the same profit as a tonne of Hindmarsh. So I've given you an assumption is a feed barley price of $220 a tonne. And obviously if you adjust that feed price, it will change the numbers that go in this particular table. I've given you 4 examples of a realised premium from nothing up to $30 a tonne. So the yield of Hindmarsh at each of those realised premiums is 100% at $0 a tonne, down to 86% at $30 a tonne. Okay, so how you read this table is, you say if you take Bass as the example, if there's no premium for Bass over Hindmarsh, so it costs you effectively the same, you have to yield the same as Hindmarsh. Now where do you do that? You yield the same as Hindmarsh if your Bass is yielding 5.6 tonne or more. Most farmers don't achieve 5.6 tonne or more. If you're within 14% of Hindmarsh, then if your Bass is going at least 2.5 tonnes, then you're going to be within 14% of Hindmarsh. So that's basically how you read this table. So okay, let's pick out the key points from the table then. So if you think that your growers and the growers themselves can achieve a realised premium of $20 a tonne over Hindmarsh, then if you can grow Bass, Bull Oak, Scope and Commander that's at least 3 tonnes per hectare and achieve that realised premium, then you're probably going to say that malt barley might be something that I want to grow on my farm. In the case of Bodan, we know there's going to be extra costs in growing it. We know that there's going to be a higher premium available to growers this coming season because Bodan is still the #1 variety that the market wants to buy. And as displayed this current harvest, there is a premium for that particular variety. But clearly, you need to have a premium of at least $30 a tonne and be in more than 3 tonne per hectare environments to be viable to grow Bodan. If you only get $20 a tonne premium, then you need to be growing more than 4.3 tonne of Bodan to perform similarly to Hindmarsh. In the case of Granger, unfortunately at the moment, there are not segregations in place and not a premium offered in the marketplace for the delivery of that particular variety. So in growing that particular variety at the moment, you are going head-to-head with Hindmarsh on a yield basis. So on a pure yield basis, where Hindmarsh and Granger are the same, is in 4.6 tonne and above environments. But clearly Hindmarsh has some other advantages over Hindmarsh in terms of you won't have to spray it for parity mildew. At the moment you don't have to for Hindmarsh, but you may do in the future. And the level of barley leaf rust you'll get in a Granger crop will be significantly less than you will get in a Hindmarsh crop. In the case of Vlamming, there is effectively no premium for Vlamming in the marketplace over Hindmarsh. So only difference in realised premium is because Vlamming has a plump grain and you'll have a very high probability of going malt compared to Hindmarsh's B Food 1. But still, the numbers don't add up for Vlamming, and you still need to be in at least 4.6 tonnes per hectare environment to be worth growing Vlaming ahead of growing hindmarsh. Okay, so on last weekend, last week the GRDC Barley Council released its current variety update for the current growing season, in which it outlines the market information and the market demand for each of the different varieties. And this was done in consultation with the trade and also with the breeders or licensees of those particular varieties. So for those of you who haven't received a copy, there are copies available of this document out at the front office with Joanna and Shay, and you can get a copy on your way out if you want to have a look at it. Otherwise, it's also available online at the GRDC website. Okay, so I've covered essentially off on all the malt varieties and where they fit in, and obviously it's not a great picture. If you're in a 3 tonne and less environment, then really hindmarsh is going to be the variety that most farmers are going to grow, and considering our state average is 2 tonnes per hectare, it clearly says that the reason that hindmarsh will be potentially 40, 50 to 60% of the area is quite justified just purely on a yield performance basis, because the premiums in the market for current malts aren't enough to justify growing a malt over hindmarsh. Okay, so the other new variety that's in the marketplace is Litmus. Litmus has been released by Intergrain in Syngenta as a feed barley at this current moment. But it's my understanding is that they are going to look at putting it to Barley Australia for consideration as a malting variety in the future. So why would you grow Litmus? Okay, the main reason that you'd grow Litmus is it contains the ALT1 gene. Now, what does this gene do? Essentially what it does is it increases the extrusion of citrate from the root apex. That reduces the toxicity of aluminium in the subsoil around the roots, which then allows the roots to extend and grow and proliferate in the soil, in the subsoil. What then you do is get increased root growth, you take up more moisture, and you end up with more yield. So I'm going to show you how the ALT1 gene works. So this is some comparisons from Wongan Hills and from Merredin in 2 different years, 2010 and 2011. And it's looking at the soil water content at spring in Hamlin and 2 Hamlin varieties that have got the aluminium gene in. So they're BC4s, so they're WB229, which is the source of the aluminium gene in Litmus, over Hamlin, over Hamlin, over Hamlin, over Hamlin. So effectively they're 94% Hamlin and almost genetically the same as Hamlin. So in both cases, what we've got on the x-axis is the soil moisture concentration, and on the y-axis is the depth. So the olive line is the bare soil, so the amount of moisture that's in the soil. The black line is the moisture uptake by Hamlin. So the difference between the olive line and the black line is obviously what the crop's taken up. Then if you look at the next 2 lines, which are the blue and the burgundy lines, they're the 2 Hamlin lines that contain the aluminium gene. Now, what you'll notice is that as towards depth, that they've taken up more moisture from the soil than Hamlin. And it may not look like much, but the impact is quite significant. So this is the results of the 2482, which is one of the aluminium lines, versus Hamlin on the same soil types as in the gravimetric soil charts, and 2 Bodan varieties that have got the aluminium gene, same thing. They're aluminium variety by Bodan, by Bodan, by Bodan, by Bodan, so they're 94% Bodan with the aluminium gene. There's a 400 kilogram increase in yield on this soil. This is a 3.9 subsoil pH, 12 part per million aluminium. This is a highly toxic soil for barley. We've got a 400 kilogram improvement in yield, when it's equivalent to about a 25% yield improvement. So this is the gene effect, and this is the gene that sits behind Litmus. Okay, so what's the benefit of this particular gene, and how does Litmus compare to standard barley varieties? So Litmus is in the red, standard barley varieties are in the green, and wheat, Kalinga and Wildcatcher in this particular case, are in the black. Now these trials were at Merredin and Wongan Hills. The year's 2010. It's a decile 3 year, a very, very low rainfall year. And what you can see is that there's about a 500 kilogram improvement in yield for Litmus over standard barley varieties. So the yield advantage of litmus was about 40% over bull oak, Hamlin, Mundar and Stirling in those two sites, about 30% above Hindmarsh, and it was the same as wheat. Okay, we go to a different year, 2011. Significantly more rainfall. The yield at Merredin's gone from 1 tonne to 2.5 tonnes per hectare. The yield at Wongan has gone from 2 tonnes to 4.5 tonnes per hectare. Okay, if we pick up the same story, we still have got over Stirling, Hamlin and Mundar about a 500 kilogram improvement in yield in growing litmus. The difference relative to bull oaks decreased and the difference relative to Hindmarsh has decreased. So the yield advantage of litmus is only about 20% over Hamlin, Mundar and Stirling. It's about 10% over the two sites over bull oak. It's the same as Hindmarsh, and again, even in a wet year, litmus yielded exactly the same as wheat. Let's look at all the data we've got then. So this is a comparison, so Hindmarsh is on the x-axis and litmus is on the y-axis. And what I've done is breaken the data into 3 pH groups. So the red dots represent soil where the subsoil pH was below 4.8. This is below the critical level for a healthy soil, and these soils should be limed. Liming is the only way to increase productivity on these soils, not by growing litmus. The blue is the opposite end of the scale. That's the alkaline soils, where boron, for example, is often a limitation to barley's productivity, and the open circles are what we consider to be neutral soils, where we're unlikely to have a pH effect on root growth. So there's a scatter of lines of data, but what you'll notice is that there clearly are some points where litmus is below the solid line and close to the bottom dotted line, which is the 2 times standard error. So there's clearly points where litmus will be lower yielding than Hindmarsh, but also there's a significant amount of points where litmus is higher yielding than Hindmarsh. Let's break this down even further into numbers. Okay, so in the sub 4.8 experiments, out of that 63, there's 20 odd that are 20 odd trials in that data set. The yield of litmus was 106% of Hindmarsh, and nearly 80% of the trials, litmus equal to or higher yielding than Hindmarsh. In the neutral set, the yield of litmus was 95% of Hindmarsh, and in about 2/3 of trials, litmus equaled or was better than Hindmarsh from a yield point of view. But in the alkaline sites, so in 4 out of 6, litmus is actually lower yielding than Hindmarsh. So what this tells us is that if you're going to grow litmus, you don't put it in paddocks that are likely to have subsoil pHs below 6.5. You're going to target soils that have got pHs below 4.8, because it's in those soils that you're likely to have a higher yield than you would out of a currant barley. It's also in those soils where this variety will give you a rotation option that you might not have considered before. Suddenly barley becomes a part of the rotation that might have been wheat on wheat on wheat on wheat. Barley can equal wheat from a yield point of view, not necessarily gross profit, from a yield point of view, and gives you the option to put another crop into your rotation. I have to be quick now. So what else has done well in NVTs over the last 2 years? It's important to point out in nearly 2/3 of trials, no varieties out-yielded Hindmarsh. Hindmarsh has been at the top of the tree with some other varieties. And very few varieties have actually out-yielded it. So all I've listed those varieties that out-yielded Hindmarsh in the top part of the chart in at least 3 trials. And so they are Compass, Lockyer, Oxford, Litmus and Flinders are the only varieties that have out-yielded Hindmarsh in the last 2 years in trials. And in most cases, in the case of Compass and Lockyer, 7 out of the 35 trials, those 2 varieties have out-yielded Hindmarsh, and in the case of Flinders, only 3 out of 35 trials. Clearly, Compass and Flinders aren't released yet. They are currently going through malt accreditation, and if accredited, they may be available to growers next year. I've mentioned Litmus, but the other 2 that are worth noting are obviously Lockyer and Oxford. Now, Oxford has a place for early sowing, and in that southwest corner, where there's lots of disease, it is clearly an outstanding variety in that particular situation. Lockyer is an underrated variety in terms of performance and has performed very well across a whole range of environments consistently over the years. In terms of varieties that yield the same as Hindmarsh, well, what it shows is that La Trobe, if accredited, will clearly be it's coming out as a feed barley this year, but it's the same yield as Hindmarsh. So for those people that are looking at it, then it will give you the same yield as you currently got with your Hindmarsh. Other options, no one grows Roe, but Roe's done very well as a variety. Fathom's a new feed barley with a long coleoptile. So if you think long coleoptile deep seeding is required for you, then obviously you'd consider Fathom, and Skipper is another option that might be coming out in the future. Okay, so in terms of the key messages for variety, those malts, if you've got 3 tonnes and you're above that, then you might consider a malt barley. If you're below 3 tonnes, then really Hindmarsh is the variety of consideration. And that certainly Granger, where you've got parity mildew and barley leaf rust, is going to be a good comparison and a good variety for those environments. Lockyer in Oxford, and obviously Scope, where you've got weeds. How much have I got, Pete? Okay. So what I wanted to just touch up on is grain protein. So we get quite a lot of questions about grain protein. Now, do varieties actually differ in their grain protein concentration? So this is the theory. The difference between A and B in their grain protein concentration is purely about yield dilution. What we're looking for is varieties like C or D, the varieties that are either lower or higher in the grain protein concentration for the yield that they have. There's nothing to do with yield dilution. It's do they accumulate more protein or less protein than another variety. So this is an example of how you might look at a data set. So this is 5 trials, 3 from WA, 2 from New South Wales, presented by Rick Graham at the 16th ABTS last year in Melbourne. And what it shows is that varieties like La Trobe, Skipper, Bull Oak and Wimmera probably differ in their grain protein concentration simply because of yield dilution. But varieties like Flinders and Bass and Commander and Granger perhaps have either a higher or lower grain protein than you'd expect from the yield. So what we've done is we've actually pulled out all of our barley agronomy time of sowing data and all of the NVT data. We've got 9 different data sets in it, and we've gone between 11 to 20 varieties, and obviously from about 45 to 137 data sets in the analysis. We've pulled out all the residuals, done from the grain protein by yield, grain protein concentration regression, and done an analysis of variance. And this is the sort of data we get out of it. So this is from, let's say, the 2005 to 2009 data set. So what we've got is, quick thing, is this dotted line is the LSD above 0, and this dotted line is the LSD below 0. So if the median of the box plot is either above or below this line, that variety is considered to have a low or a high grain protein concentration for its yield. So in this data set, Roe and Sterling were considered to be high protein varieties, and Commander, it's a bit hard to read actually, Bull Oak and Fleet were considered to have a low protein, and the other varieties, if they differed in their grain protein concentration in the trials, it was simply due to yield dilution. Okay, this is another of the data sets, so 2010 to 2013, 17 varieties from 59 sites, and again, what it suggests is that this group of varieties here, Flinders, Roe, Wimmera, Vlaming, Gardner and Bass in that particular case, had a median grain protein, so 50% of their data sets were above 0 and were considered to have a high protein, and Commander, Henley, Bull Oak and Fleet were considered to have a low protein. So if we group all that data together, so the 9 sites, the 11 to 12 varieties, take out all the feeds because protein's not important for delivery of a feed, and then we rank the varieties and try and class them into broad groups. This is the sort of picture that we pick up. Now what's important from this picture is only the extremes. So only those varieties that are in the low protein box, and only the varieties that are in the high protein box, because they're the ones that you're going to have to manage differently. So our key messages about grain protein is that for some varieties, differences in their grain protein concentration are nothing to do with their yield. It's genetic. It's the low and high protein varieties that we need to consider ourselves. So for say Bass, which is a high protein variety, you might need to actually get more of your nitrogen on early. You need to promote tillering to try and dilute some of that nitrogen out. You might need to target a lower protein target when you're doing your protein budgeting in terms of how much fertiliser nitrogen is going to go in the crop. In case of Commander, it's more about getting the nitrogen closer to the end of tillering, so it's available then to put into the grain rather than putting into biomass. Or it might be sowing early onto high fertility paddocks. So in summary, these are the key messages from my presentation, is that yes, high marsh is the benchmark variety, but there are options. So litmus for acidic soils, and there on those particular soils it will equal wheat, and it will give growers an option to diversify their current rotation. As well, litmus will give paddocks where there is subsoil acidity in them more yield stability. The second thing is that if you've got malt barley and you can realise the malt potential of about $20 to $30 a tonne, and you are in a +3 tonne environment, then certainly there are the environments where malt barley should be considered as an alternative to hindmarsh. And scope where you've got an EMI herbicide either used or needed to control weeds. There are new options coming. So Compass, Flinders, Latrobe and Skipper are certainly have the potential to yield the same, or if not higher than hindmarsh. And obviously if they get a malt premium, will certainly become competitive options for growing. And in terms of grain protein concentration, yes, some varieties do differ in their grain protein concentration. Most of them are similar to each other, and it's purely yield dilution. But of the ones that we're currently growing, it's probably Bass and Commander that we need to be most aware of. And if you're growing those two on your farm, you probably need to have quite different strategies for managing them on your farm. Cool.
Garen Nell from Consult Ag. Blakely, what does the barley or the malt barley industry say when you show them that chart of the premium spreads and the fit for hindmarsh versus malt?
What do they say?
Or, yeah, what's their response when they can see their incentives aren't great enough for growers to grow malt varieties over 85% of the wheat belt?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's where we're at the moment, is we're heading towards 60% domination by hindmarsh, and clearly that's going to make malt barley supply tight. Obviously a consequence of that is price might go up, which then makes it attractive to grow a malt, but clearly it's only a short-term gap, because with the release of Latrobe or Compass, the market acceptance of Granger, for example, then we're going to have varieties that are as good as hindmarsh from a yield point of view, which will have the malt barley stamp, and we'll go back to the other scenarios that malt becomes a dominant crop in the system. We've got short-term pain at the moment for the market. Obviously last year there was 3.8 million tonne of barley grown. There's still 1 million tonne of malt barley delivered. That's all they need anyway, so they were happy. So years like last year, that they won't care because they've got enough supply.
Blakely, Craig Brown, Synergy. There's a lot of interest in Latrobe, probably with some few growers just holding off on their hindmarsh areas because of the interest in Latrobe. So it concerns me. Every barley variety's got an Achilles heel. So any thoughts on where Latrobe's is? Because it's sounding too good to be true, which is obviously very concerning.
There are areas where hindmarsh had mid-stem break this year. So there was a lot of guys that probably suffered some yield loss as a consequence of mid-stem break. Clearly, hindmarsh has done very well in Eastern Australia as well. So it's a dominant variety in Victoria and parts of New South Wales. I think it's gaining some acreage in South Australia. So if it has an Achilles heel, then obviously that'll be reflected in Latrobe. Latrobe's a sister line of hindmarsh. Clearly, it's from a production point of view, it's not as plump, say, as a Vlaming or a Bass or a Sterling. So it's still not going to be ultra reliable from that point of view. From a grain brightness point of view, again, it's not a super bright variety. So again, that may affect some of the delivery stuff. I think there were reports of germ staining on the issue, so it may come down to the quality aspects, but certainly from a production point of view, in those sub 3 tonne environments, then it's going to be Latrobe would naturally replace Hindmarsh and become, the new benchmark, along with, say, Compass, which would be the other one that would come out in those sub-3 tonners. But obviously in those 3-tonne pluses, then there are other options that suddenly come into play depending on what market demand is for them. And really what it comes down to is it doesn't matter how good the variety is. If no one's going to buy it and pay you a premium for it, then effectively, you don't have a market.